is a member of federal parliament, a Liberal member of federal parliament, who chairs a review of foreign investor property acquisitions. Kelly O'Dwyer is the member for Higgins. It's the seat that Peter Costello occupied for so long in federal parliament. She's been asked to look into the vexed question of what should Australia do, if anything, about people buying real estate and businesses when they're not Australian citizens or residents. Kelly O'Dwyer, good morning to you.
Good morning, John.
And this comes as the Weekly Times report today that one of the tenders for the Port of Melbourne privatisation is a company owned by the Chinese government. Not a Chinese private investor, but a government investor. Alarm bells ringing?
Well, look, John, what we have been tasked to do is actually look specifically at residential property. So it doesn't cover what you're talking about in relation to the port. But what I would say is we do have a foreign investment framework in place that says that despite the monetary thresholds that apply to normal commercial enterprises before they have screening through the Foreign Investment Review Board for a state-owned enterprise, whether it's Chinese-owned or any other government that controls and runs that state-owned enterprise, it actually needs to get approval through the Foreign Investment Review Board process before it can proceed.
I do remember your predecessors in office looked at exactly this, and I think an up-and-coming young, ambitious politician then called Bill Shorten was given the task of looking into whether or not we had a problem, and they came back and said, look, the numbers we're talking about, the actual numbers of properties and the value combined of the investment is tiny. Have you got those same figures?
Well, look, in terms of what the Foreign Investment Review Board have said in their annual report last year, the dollar figure that we're talking about with both commercial and residential real estate combined is just over $50 billion in this country. Around about $17 billion of that applies to residential real estate. And we don't yet have the breakdown from the Foreign Investment Review Board as to how much of that applies really to existing dwellings and how much is new stock. And that's part of the issue that we're wanting to talk about, because different rules apply to both. And I think it's important for your listeners to understand that we do have a reasonably robust framework in place now. Foreign investors that are non-residents can invest in housing stock that will increase the dwellings in Australia. We think that that is actually of benefit to Australians and of benefit to builders and also to suppliers. New dwelling stock, so increasing the dwelling stock that's available to everybody. But in terms of existing properties, there are already rules in place that say a foreign investor is not able to purchase existing dwellings. That's not
is
something.
There a threshold under which they don't report transactions to the Foreign Investment Review Board?
No.
So even if it's a $20,000 block in the bush?
Yep, that's right.
Now, then there's any number of anecdotes, and everyone you talk to, everyone's got a story. Oh, I went to an auction and, 99% of the people there, the auction was conducted in Chinese. Or there's ads now that are, they're in the shop windows and they're all in Chinese, and, Australians aren't even allowed to buy these properties. You hear all of this stuff. You must have heard it too.
Well, look, you hear a lot of anecdotes, John, and I think this is one of the reasons why it's actually important to conduct this review, because we do hear a lot of anecdotes, and anecdotes become local folklore, and we need to be able to distinguish between anecdote and fact. And that's why the Economics Committee is actually conducting a very methodical review where we've got some pretty broad terms of reference that apply to residential real estate. We have to look at whether we're receiving the benefits, the foreign investment benefits that we believe we should be receiving. We're going to look at whether or not the existing framework is being applied.
Now, Canada's just changed its rules, particularly because of an influx of Chinese capital. And ironically, that's meant that many Chinese investors who can't now go to China and can't go to places in other countries where you have to have specific permits, visas or whatever it might be, they're in fact more inclined to come to Australia.
Well, we have one of the terms of reference looking at the international experience right across the world, and certainly that's an example that you talk about. There are specific investor classes in Canada. They shut down one of their programs. I had the opportunity to speak with the Reserve Bank Governor, because we have oversight of the Reserve Bank. Bank, and I asked him that question. Do you think that there is going to be a move of capital from other countries where they've been investing into residential real estate and property overseas, flowing into Australia? He said he was reasonably sanguine at the moment in relation to that, but that is something that we'll obviously keep a close eye on. We know, for instance, in Hong Kong in 2012, there was a new tax that they slapped on foreign investors when they were investing in real estate there of 15%. So
in Hong Kong? That's
correct, in Hong Kong.
Well, why wouldn't we do for Hong Kong why wouldn't we do to Chinese citizens what the Chinese government's doing to our citizens?
Well, we're looking at all of those things.
In other words, we'll treat you. In fact, I think that's what Nigel from Cheltenham wants to ask. Nigel, why don't you ask it? You'll do it better than me.
Thanks, John. Good morning, Kelly.
Good morning, Nigel.
I think we should be starting from the single premise that if we can't buy in your country, you can't buy in ours. Now, I've experienced this because my wife is from Thailand and we've got some property interests over in Thailand. And I, the foreigner, cannot 100% own anything in that country. You cannot own any land to start with. And it's very difficult to get ownership of even condominiums and things like that in, as far as the land acquisition is concerned as part of that process. So
for every country on the globe, you have a reciprocal arrangement, is what you're saying, are you?
That's exactly right, John. And that's not hard to work out because, for example, despite the so-called free trade agreement with Thailand, nothing as far as property rights for Australians has changed at all.
Okay, Kelly?
Well, you're right in relation to free trade agreements. They don't apply to residential property, so nobody should be under any misapprehension that any free trade agreement is going to change that in any way. Look, around the world there are different property laws. Some countries lease property, some countries have freehold land, as we do. We apply our own laws, and what we have said is we want to make sure that we're not increasing the cost of housing for Australians. In fact, we're wanting to make sure that we're adding to the new stock that's actually available. And foreign investment can be important in being able to do that.
What's wrong with that in principle as a framework, saying, well, whatever laws apply to Australians buying in your country are the laws that apply to you in our country?
Well, because we have our own laws in relation to property.
Yeah,
and
we can make that our law.
Yes, but we're not going to have different laws that apply to different individuals.
Why not?
Well, because it's a very complicated system, John, and I just don't
say what country, unless people are multiple citizenships.
Well, I think
you can say, okay, if you're from Greenland or Uzbekistan, can Australians buy land in Uzbekistan, and that determines whether Uzbeks can buy land here?
Well, I suppose the question then might be, well, would we apply sort of different laws to those people, when they come here as well? I mean, the truth is, one law applies to everybody in this country, and we're not looking to change the property laws in that regard. But what we will do is we will ensure that everybody has a fair go, and that is why we are conducting this inquiry, to get the facts on the table, to make sure that nobody's rorting the system. I mean, I'll give you an example here, Nigel, and that is that, if we do find that somebody hasn't received Foreign Investment Review Board approval, they're a foreign investor, they've purchased multiple properties, the government can in fact sell up on them, and has done in the past during previous coalition governments. But the question is, are the penalties appropriate at the moment? And at the moment, the penalties, in addition to selling them up, the penalties are really only around about $85,000. And I query whether, in fact, that's enough of a prohibition for people doing the wrong thing.
Let's keep moving through. We've got lots of callers who are obviously interested in this issue. Andrew from Brighton's one of them. Morning, Andrew.
Good morning. I've had first-hand experience where I was asked to join a joint venture largely led by a Chinese base of a power station project in Mildura. And before they knew they were successful, they bought large tracts of land on the basis of the power station project, which was being expedited to be done because it was good for Victoria. And I tried to tell them it was uneconomic where they chose the land. But in actual fact, they bought the land and they're using it for grazing and farming. It was getting past all the regulations we've got to prevent it.
Okay, well, Kelly, you're looking at residential real estate specifically.
Yeah, we're looking at residential real estate, but I will just make a comment on what Andrew has said, which is that if people haven't received their Foreign Investment Review Board approval, that is a very significant issue, and I would suggest, Andrew, that you actually ought to contact the Foreign Investment Review Board in relation to that. And secondly, if you're granted specific approval to do specific things, if you don't do it, again, that is an issue for the Foreign Investment Review Board.
John in Doncaster. Morning, John.
Oh, hi, John. The issue that I think you've got to talk about is who these people are using to build the houses. We had a house next to us that was slapped up, and that was their words, by our friends Metricon.
Well, now we've got a problem, John, because you've gone and named a particular company, so I'm afraid I can't hear the rest of your story because you've named a particular company, which makes it very, very difficult for us here. So thank you for your call, and we'll leave that one there. Brian in Windsor, good morning to you.
Good morning, John. John, I just want to bring to your attention that 4 years ago I sold my house, and it was purchased by a Chinese couple. They weren't married, but they had an Australian address. The contract of sale was signed. About 10 days later, the agent rang me and said, look, the purchasers have gone to China, because I'd asked if we could change the period of the purchase arrangements. Yeah.
Yep.
They'd gone to China. They came back 2 weeks later, and the request came, could we change the purchaser details on the contract?
Which is very common. There's a nominee clause, nothing unusual there at all.
Exactly, and I wasn't concerned about it.
So the purchasers have on-sold the property to others?
Yep.
Okay.
But when the change came, there were 10 other names added to the purchaser's contract. And I didn't think about it at the time. I just thought, gee, well...
So the original 2 were still there, plus 10 more?
Plus 10 more.
Okay,
yes.
So is this for immigration purposes?
Well, no. Well, it could have been for immigration purposes, or it could have been just an investment situation where 2 people live in Australia. They bought the property here, went to China, sold it, and it's still being rented. It's a rental property.
Okay.
So Brian...
this is an opportunity where people are making money out of purchasing properties in Australia.
Okay.
And in the process, they're pushing up the rental costs.
Do you care who buys your house when you sell it, Brian?
I don't care, but I do care that we are selling property to people who don't live in Australia and are residents in Australia.
Okay, what if it was a dozen people from France who were investors and formed a business to invest in real estate in Australia?
Absolutely the same thing.
Okay,
because what it's doing is it's affecting the cost of retail sales and the availability of housing in this country.
So Brian, I mean, if these are foreign investors, non-residential investors looking to purchase an existing dwelling, which it sounds like that's what it was, an existing either apartment or townhouse or house, whatever it might have been, Brian, they're not able to do that without Foreign Investment Review Board approval, and it wouldn't be given in those circumstances. It doesn't matter if they're investing with an Australian citizen or anybody else, they simply can't do it under the existing framework. So I'm not sure of the background of the people who'd purchased your property, but it would be contrary to the rules as they presently exist.
Thank you for your call, for all your calls. Kelly, we'll maybe take an opportunity to get you to come back because there's a full board of people with questions for you and we've run out of time.
I'd really
Very
like
briefly,
that, John.
Tony Abbott in the studio sitting in that chair a short while ago. You've got a bit of a task in front of you to sell this budget, haven't you?
Well, look, I think the big task ahead of us is to explain to the Australian people the situation that we inherited from the former Labor government. We've said that we would deliver a responsible budget. We've done that, and we have to explain each and every one of those measures, and we'll continue to do that, John.
Kelly O'Dwyer, the member for Higgins. It's news time now, 10 o'clock.